There once lived a king who defeated giants, conquered kingdoms, and composed hymns that still stir the soul. But one day, when his heart felt invincible, he ordered something God had never commanded: to count the people. That simple census became the seed of a deadly plague. What you're about to discover today will reveal how an act of pride can move heaven, how power without obedience brings ruin, and how even a king can fall when he trusts in numbers more than in his God. Leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from and what topic you'd like to see next. Thank you for supporting this space. David's reign was living its golden age. The wars had ceased, treasures filled Jerusalem, and singers chanted his name in the squares. Yet behind the brightness of success hid a shadow, the desire to measure his greatness. When a man grows accustomed to applause, he risks forgetting that everything comes from God. That temptation crept into the king's heart, and what seemed like military wisdom was, in truth, pride disguised as prudence. David summoned his general Joab, the warrior who had shared with him both victories and tears. "Go and count Israel from Dan to Beersheba," the monarch ordered firmly. Joab looked at him in confusion. "Why does my lord wish to know the number of the people? Doesn't God himself multiply Israel's strength?" But David insisted. His words no longer carried prayer, only command. The obedience of a soldier clashed with the silence of a God who watched. The counting began. Messengers departed north and south, recording names and men of war. For months they crossed villages, deserts, and fortresses. What was meant to be a census became a display of power. Joab fulfilled the order with a heavy heart, while David waited for the results with a mix of pride and unease. Sometimes the greatest test doesn't come in battle, but in abundance. When everything seems secure, the heart lets down its guard. 9 months and 20 days passed. The scrolls returned to the palace with astonishing figures: 800,000 valiant men in Israel and 500,000 in Judah. Silence filled the hall. No one spoke, yet something in the air shifted. David took the report with trembling hands. The gleam of triumph faded from his eyes. There was no music, no songs, only the echo of his conscience. In that moment, he understood that he had counted the people, but lost his peace. That night, while Jerusalem slept, the king could not rest. The sound of soldiers in the courtyard echoed like a rebuke. In the dimness of his chamber, David buried his face in his hands and whispered, "I have sinned greatly against the Lord." What had seemed like an act of governance had become a spiritual offense. The number meant to show his strength only exposed his weakness. David fell to his knees and prayed with a broken heart. "I beg you, Lord, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have acted foolishly." The echo of his cry mingled with the wind of dawn. Outside, Jerusalem still did not know that a royal decree had reached the limits of divine patience. When man trusts more in his strength than in grace, heaven remains silent. But that silence always precedes something. At dawn, the prophet Gad arrived at the palace. His gaze was grave, like that of a man bearing a message no one wishes to hear. "Thus says the Lord," he announced, "I give you 3 choices: 3 years of famine, 3 months fleeing from your enemies, or 3 days of plague upon your land." Time seemed to stand still. Every word weighed like iron. The voice of God did not come to destroy him, but to confront him with his own heart. David took a deep breath, tears streaming down his beard. He could not run from his guilt or shift it onto his men. "I am in great distress," he confessed. "Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men." In that sentence, the warrior surrendered completely. He had learned that numbers do not save, swords do not redeem, and only divine compassion can sustain a broken kingdom. Then the punishment began. From the northern border to the hills of Judah, a burning wind swept through the fields. In a single day, the cities filled with mourning. Mothers wept for their children, and priests tore their garments. 70,000 men fell, and the whole land seemed to hold its breath. What began with pride ended in supplication. Even the king understood that no number could purchase the mercy of God. From the terrace of his palace, David watched the smoke rising on the horizon. The sound of lamentations drifted like a current of pain rising from the valley. He clung to the wall with trembling hands. This was not a war against enemies, but against the error of his own heart. For the first time in years, the king felt small before the magnitude of judgment. It was not an enemy who struck him. It was the consequence of his pride. As the scribes fled the city, David lifted his eyes and saw a terrifying vision. An angel suspended between heaven and earth, with a sword stretched out over Jerusalem. Lightning illuminated the celestial figure, and the people ran in terror. Then the Lord stopped the messenger and said, "Enough, withdraw your hand." It was the most decisive moment in the king's life. Justice was restrained by the cry of mercy. David fell face down and wept with a broken voice. "I am the one who has sinned, but these sheep, what have they done?" In his cry echoed the anguish of a shepherd watching his flock die. He realized that true leadership is not measured by armies or victories, but by the willingness to intercede for others. When the heart humbles itself, God begins to write a new story upon the ruins of failure. Then the prophet Gad spoke again. "Rise and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." David rose with determination. He was still trembling, but he knew he must turn his guilt into an offering. Dust rose from the road as he descended toward that sacred place. He did not go as a king, but as a broken man seeking to redeem his people through sincere worship. Araunah saw him coming from afar and ran to meet him, bowing to the ground. "Take my threshing floor, my wood, and my oxen for the sacrifice," he said reverently. But David replied, "I will not offer to the Lord a sacrifice that costs me nothing." That phrase became eternal. In a world that seeks what is easy, he chose the price. For true worship is not measured by words, but by what we are willing to give. David took the oxen, prepared the wood, and built the altar with his own hands. Sweat ran down his face, but with every strike he felt something within him being rebuilt as well. He did not speak. He only breathed deeply as the sound of the hammer filled the air. Around him, the men watched in silence. The king who once counted the people was now learning to count his own faults before God. When the altar was ready, he placed the offering upon it. The smoke began to rise, mingling with the heavy air of the afternoon. David closed his eyes and prayed, "Lord, accept this sacrifice and heal the land." Suddenly, fire descended from heaven and consumed the offering. Everyone fell to their knees. The earth trembled softly, and the angel sheathed his sword. Judgment ended where worship began. There, guilt was transformed into an altar. The silence that followed was sacred. Tears ran down the hardened faces of the soldiers. The wind carried away the scent of smoke and death, leaving only the aroma of sacrifice. Jerusalem, wounded and trembling, breathed once more. David lifted his eyes to the sky, bathed in golden light. He understood that mercy is not earned, it is received. God had stayed his hand not because of merit, but because of grace. In that very place, the Lord spoke again to his heart. That threshing floor, the property of a foreigner, would one day become the site where the temple would be built. From tragedy would rise the future sanctuary. David realized that even mistakes can become sacred foundations when surrendered to God. The ground of his guilt would become the place where generations would find forgiveness. What once brought judgment was now preparing redemption. The king stepped back a few paces and watched the altar burn slowly until it dimmed. Every spark seemed like a prayer ascending to heaven. Deep within, he knew he would never again count the people, not out of fear of punishment, but because he had learned that what is counted does not define what is eternal. Israel was great, yes, but not because of its numbers, rather because of God's presence among them, and that lesson, etched in fire, he would never forget. Days passed, and the people began to rise again. Families reunited among the ruins, and the fields slowly turned green once more. In the midst of that renewal, David no longer sat on his throne with pride, but with gratitude. Each sunrise was a second chance. Sometimes God does not remove the consequences, but he transforms their weight into wisdom. Jerusalem learned that true strength does not lie in the army, but in obedience. David commanded that the place where the fire had descended be preserved. Here the house of the Lord will be built, he declared. His eyes, still marked by tears, shone with reverence. On the ground that had known judgment, worship would now rise. The sight of Araunah's threshing floor became a symbol of restoration, reminding all that even wounds can be redeemed when surrendered to the divine presence. The priests began to offer regular sacrifices upon that altar. The people ascended with instruments, incense, and new songs. Sorrow slowly turned into gratitude. Each offering reminded them that forgiveness always carries a cost, but also a promise, that God can once again dwell among men. That generation witnessed how mercy rebuilds what pride destroys. On silent nights, David would often return to that place alone. He knelt upon the blackened stones and prayed without uttering a word. The echo of the plague still lived in his memory, but no longer as condemnation, rather as a witness. For true repentance does not erase the past, it turns it into an altar. In every prayer, he remembered that the counting of his people had ended, but the counting of God's grace was infinite. In time, David instructed his son Solomon to build the temple on that very site. God, stop the judgment there, my son. There his glory will descend. His voice trembled, but no longer with fear, this time with hope. He understood that his downfall would serve as the foundation for the future. Sometimes wisdom is born from pain. The same ground that once felt the wrath of God would become the dwelling place of his eternal presence. Over the years, that altar became a meeting point between heaven and earth. Pilgrims came from afar to remember how God had stayed the angel's hand. The elders would tell the story to the children by the fire. A king sought to measure his power, and the Lord showed him that only he owns the count of the world. That lesson passed through generations, a warning wrapped in mercy. David came to understand that true greatness is not found in knowing how many follow you, but in knowing whom you follow. His heart was purified through pain, and from that purification sprang a new faith. The man who once counted soldiers now counted promises. Each time he looked at the altar, he remembered that God does not seek perfection, but hearts willing to be broken so they can be restored. That is the measure heaven honors. The account of the plague was written in the Chronicles of the kingdom, but also in Israel's conscience. No military record ever held the same worth again. The generations that followed learned that numbers never define blessing. In times of abundance and power, the prophets would quote David as an example of the danger of pride. For what is written in tears becomes eternal teaching for those who come after. The years passed, and the king grew old. His eyes no longer searched for battlefields, but for the faces of worshippers. As he looked upon Jerusalem, he understood that the greatest census was not of men, but of hearts that love God. He had learned that pride may wear royal robes, but only humility sustains a true throne. In that final peace, he found rest. Judgment had been transformed into perpetual worship. This story did not remain in the past. Today, many still measure their worth by numbers, achievements, or followers. Yet the message remains the same. When the heart fills with pride, God stops the counting, not to destroy us, but to remind us that eternity cannot be measured. The altar of David calls us to surrender what is easy and to offer what costs. There, grace always begins again. David understood that the judgment was not punishment but correction. God did not destroy him. He stopped him in time. He made him look inward, to the place where pride had replaced faith. This is how the Lord works. He allows us to stumble to save us from a greater fall. On that altar of Araunah, the king learned that a broken heart is worth more than 1,000 armies. There his era ended, and his true worship began. Perhaps today you too are counting what you shouldn't, your achievements, your strength, your securities. Maybe, without realizing it, you've been trusting more in what is visible than in the voice that sustains you. But God, just as he did with David, knows how to stop us before disaster strikes. Sometimes he takes away numbers to restore purpose. Because when everything is reduced, that's when we hear his call most clearly. It's not loss, it's divine redirection. The altar of David still burns in every repentant heart. There, pride surrenders and grace rewrites the story. If today you feel distant, pray right where you are and say, Lord, teach me to trust only in you. He still stops invisible plagues, restores lives, and gives peace where there was once failure. If this message spoke to your soul, share it, subscribe, and write in the comments which part touched you the most. May the mercy of God always be with you.